The air in Westminster turned ice cold, every eye locked on King Charles as he rose from his seat, his face carved in stone. Prime Minister Keir Starmer stood frozen at the dispatch box, papers trembling in his hands. What happened next has never been seen in British political history. The King just shattered every rule of constitutional monarchy, and the fallout will change Britain forever. This is the confrontation that Parliament will never forget. The morning started like any other Wednesday in Parliament. Keir Starmer arrived at Westminster expecting routine business, answering standard questions, defending policies with his usual measured responses. But something felt different the moment he stepped into the chamber. The benches were packed, every single seat filled. MPs who normally skip Prime Minister's questions were suddenly present, whispering urgently to one another. The press gallery overflowed with journalists, cameras ready, sensing something massive in the air. Nobody knew what was coming, but everyone felt it. The tension was suffocating. Starmer took his position at the dispatch box, straightening his papers, preparing his notes. Across the chamber, opposition MPs sat unusually quiet. No jeering, no theatrical outbursts, just silence. Heavy, oppressive silence. The Speaker called the House to order, his voice carrying an edge of nervousness. That's when the side door opened. Every head turned. The room gasped as one. King Charles entered the chamber, not in ceremonial robes, not for a state opening. He wore a dark suit, his expression grave, his jaw set. This was unprecedented, unconstitutional, shocking beyond measure. The King had never done this. No monarch had entered Parliament uninvited during active session in over 3 centuries. The unwritten rules of British democracy forbid it. The monarchy observes, it doesn't interfere. It advises privately, never publicly confronts. But Charles walked down the centre aisle with purpose, his footsteps echoing through the stunned silence. MPs sat frozen in disbelief. Some half rose from their seats, unsure whether to bow or protest. Starmer's face drained of colour. His hands gripped the dispatch box so hard his knuckles turned white. Whatever he planned to say evaporated from his mind. Charles stopped just metres from the Prime Minister. The two men locked eyes. Decades of constitutional tradition hung in the balance. The King spoke first. His voice low, but carrying through the chamber with absolute authority. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word landed like a hammer blow. He addressed Starmer directly, bypassing every protocol, every custom, every careful boundary that separates Crown from Parliament. The words he spoke have still not been fully released to the public, but witnesses describe them as devastating. Clinical, personal, a point-by-point dismantling of recent government decisions that left Starmer unable to respond. The Prime Minister tried to speak, his voice cracking. He attempted to assert parliamentary privilege to remind everyone that the Crown cannot dictate policy to elected officials. But Charles raised one hand, silencing him without a word. The gesture was simple but carried the weight of 1,000 years of royal authority. Around the chamber, MPs sat paralysed. Some Conservatives looked triumphant. Labour backbenchers appeared horrified. The Speaker sat helpless, clutching his ceremonial mace, unsure whether to intervene or witness history unfolding. What drove the King to this moment? Rumours had circulated for weeks about growing tensions between Buckingham Palace and Downing Street. Starmer's government had pushed through controversial legislation, policies on taxation of royal estates, proposed reforms to the House of Lords that would diminish aristocratic influence, budget cuts affecting military regiments with royal connections, changes to Commonwealth relationships that Charles reportedly opposed privately. But private opposition had apparently reached its limit. The King decided the time for quiet diplomacy had ended. He chose nuclear confrontation instead. Charles referenced specific cabinet meetings. He quoted private conversations that should never have left secure rooms. He revealed the existence of letters, formal warnings he had sent to the Prime Minister over the past months, all ignored. The constitutional crisis wasn't just about this moment. It had been building in secret while the British public remained completely unaware. The King had been pushed too far, and now he was pushing back with everything at his disposal. The monarchy was reasserting itself in ways he's not seen since the English Civil War. Starmer finally found his voice, stammering a response about democratic principles, about the will of the people expressed through elections. His arguments sounded hollow in the face of Charles's fury. The king countered every point, not with emotion, but with cold facts. He cited opinion polls showing public disapproval of specific policies. He mentioned economic data the government had downplayed. He brought up international criticism that Starmer's administration had dismissed. Charles wasn't just defending royal prerogatives, he was positioning himself as the voice of a frustrated nation, claiming to speak for millions who felt unheard by their elected government. The confrontation intensified. Charles stepped closer, invading the Prime Minister's space in a way that would seem aggressive in any other context. But this was the king. Starmer couldn't retreat, couldn't defend himself properly without appearing to challenge the crown itself. The trap was perfect. Any strong response would look like attacking the monarchy. Any weak response would look like admission of failure. Starmer chose silence, his face flushed, his breathing visible. The chamber remained deathly quiet, witnessing the Prime Minister's humiliation in real time. Not a single Labour MP dared to defend him. Not one voice rose in protest. They all sensed that intervening would only make things worse. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but lasted mere seconds. Charles wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document, holding it up for the entire chamber to see. The paper looked official, bearing what appeared to be royal seals and formal letterhead. Witnesses later described it as a formal notice, a constitutional instrument that hadn't been invoked in living memory. The king unfolded it slowly, deliberately, making every MP wait and watch as he prepared to read its contents aloud. Starmer's eyes widened as he recognised what it might be. His political career, his entire agenda, everything he'd worked towards since taking office suddenly hung by a thread. The document represented power that most modern politicians had forgotten the monarchy still possessed. Charles began reading in measured tones, each word carefully enunciated. The document outlined specific concerns about government overreach, about policies implemented without proper constitutional consultation, about decisions made that affected Crown prerogatives without following established protocols. It wasn't a declaration of war against democracy itself, but rather a reminder that British constitutional government operates on balance between Crown, Parliament and people. That balance, according to the King's reading, had been deliberately disrupted by Starmer's administration. The Prime Minister had apparently believed he could ignore centuries of tradition because those traditions weren't codified in written law. Charles was demonstrating that unwritten rules still carry enormous weight when backed by royal authority and public respect for the institution. The chamber erupted as Charles finished reading. Not in applause or support, may I tell you, but in chaos. MPs jumped to their feet, some shouting questions, others demanding points of order, many simply standing in shock without knowing what to say or do. The Speaker hammered his gavel repeatedly, trying desperately to restore order, but his authority seemed meaningless compared to what had just transpired. Conservative MPs began chanting for Starmer's resignation, seizing the moment to attack a wounded opponent. Labour members looked to their leader for guidance, for some response that would salvage the situation, but Starmer remained rooted in place, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. His closest allies sat frozen, unable to mount any defence without risking further constitutional crisis. Charles stood unmoved amid the pandemonium, watching the chaos he'd unleashed with an expression that revealed nothing. This was calculated. Every moment had been planned, every word chosen to maximum effect. The king wasn't acting on impulse or emotion. This was strategic deployment of constitutional power that had been carefully researched and prepared. Legal experts and constitutional historians had clearly been consulted. The document he'd read wasn't some hastily written complaint, but rather a formal instrument prepared over weeks or months, waiting for the right moment to be deployed. That moment was now. and Charles had chosen it perfectly when Parliament was in full session, when cameras were rolling, when the entire political establishment was present to witness government authority challenged by Crown authority. Security personnel began moving toward the chamber, unsure whether they should intervene, uncertain who even had authority in this unprecedented situation. Do you protect the Prime Minister from the King? Do you escort the King from Parliament? The Metropolitan Police officers stationed at Westminster exchanged confused glances, their training having never covered anything remotely like this scenario. Palace security detail accompanying Charles stood ready but relaxed, knowing their presence was symbolic. Nobody was going to physically remove the monarch from Parliament. The very idea was unthinkable, regardless of constitutional propriety. The King's person remained inviolable, and everyone present understood that fundamental reality. Starmer finally attempted to respond, his voice shaking but growing stronger as he spoke. He reminded the chamber that Parliament held supremacy under British constitutional law, that elected representatives answered to voters, not to hereditary monarchy, that this confrontation violated every understanding of modern democratic governance. His words carried legal weight and historical precedent, but they sounded defensive, almost pleading. Charles listened without expression, letting the Prime Minister exhaust his arguments before responding with a single devastating question. He asked Starmer directly whether he disputed the specific facts outlined in the royal document, whether he denied the private warnings that had been sent and ignored, whether he claimed the government had properly consulted on matters affecting Crown interests. The questions were traps. Answering yes would be provably false. Answering no would admit wrongdoing. The Prime Minister stumbled through a non-answer, talking about process and procedure, about the complexities of modern governance, about the need for elected officials to make difficult decisions. It sounded like excuse-making. It sounded weak. Charles had succeeded in making Britain's most powerful elected official appear powerless in his own chamber before his own colleagues. The psychological impact was immense. Every MP present would remember this moment forever. Every future interaction between Downing Street and Buckingham Palace would be coloured by what happened here. The balance of power hadn't formally shifted, but the perception of power had changed dramatically. The monarchy had reminded everyone that constitutional conventions can be weapons when wielded by someone willing to break them. Social media outside Parliament exploded instantly. Videos of Charles entering the chamber went viral within minutes. Hashtags demanding Starmer's resignation began trending alongside hashtags defending parliamentary democracy. The nation divided in real time, some celebrating the King's intervention as necessary correction of government overreach. Others condemning it as royal tyranny attempting to override democratic will. International observers watched in disbelief as one of the world's oldest democracies appeared to teeter on the edge of constitutional breakdown. American news networks interrupted regular programming. European parliaments issued carefully worded statements. Commonwealth nations, with Charles as their head of state, scrambled to understand implications for their own governance. The confrontation had now lasted over 20 minutes, an eternity in parliamentary time, where speeches are measured and timed with precision. Charles showed no signs of leaving, no indication that he considered his point made. Instead, he turned away from Starmer and addressed the chamber as a whole, sweeping his gaze across the packed benches. He spoke about duty and responsibility, about the sacred trust between government and governed, about promises made to the British people that had been broken or ignored. His words weren't partisan attacks on Labour specifically, but rather broader criticisms that could apply to any administration that lost sight of its fundamental obligations. This rhetorical strategy was brilliant because it prevented his intervention from appearing purely political, from seeming like royal preference for Conservative over Labour policy. Charles positioned himself above party politics, claiming to defend principles that transcended electoral cycles and partisan advantage. MPs from all parties found themselves nodding along to certain points, even as they recognised the dangerous precedent being established. The King's concerns about government transparency resonated with backbenchers who felt excluded from decision-making by powerful party leadership. His comments about consultation and proper process appealed to constitutional conservatives who value tradition and established procedure. His references to public opinion struck chords with MPs nervous about their own re-election prospects amid falling approval ratings. Charles was masterfully building a coalition of sympathy that crossed party lines, isolating Starmer not just from opponents, but potentially from his own supporters. The Prime Minister could see his parliamentary majority becoming meaningless if enough Labour MPs decided the King had legitimate grievances that deserved acknowledgement. Television cameras captured every moment, beaming images around the world of a monarch directly challenging elected authority in ways that seemed impossible in modern democracy. Constitutional experts began appearing on news channels struggling to explain what was happening because there existed no clear precedent, no established framework for understanding this scenario. Some argued Charles had committed an act of constitutional vandalism that threatened the foundation of British parliamentary democracy. Others suggested he was exercising reserved powers that technically still existed, even if unused, for centuries. Legal scholars debated whether the King had actually violated any law or merely broken conventions that carried no formal legal weight. The answer mattered enormously because it determined whether this was criminal act or simply unprecedented, but technically permissible behaviour. Inside Parliament, the Speaker finally found his voice and attempted to assert control. He declared that irregular proceedings must end, that the Chamber needed to return to scheduled business, that constitutional questions raised today would require careful consideration by proper authorities. His words sounded authoritative but rang hollow. Charles glanced at him briefly, and that single look conveyed volumes. The King wasn't subject to the Speaker's authority. Parliamentary procedure governed MPs and ministers, but didn't bind the monarch. The Speaker's power derived ultimately from Crown authority delegated through constitutional arrangement. Attempting to order the King around inverted that entire relationship in ways that were legally and symbolically impossible. The Speaker fell silent again, recognising the futility of his position. Starmer made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. He proposed that he and His Majesty retire to a private room for continued discussion, removing the confrontation from public spectacle, restoring some dignity to both Crown and government. It was a reasonable suggestion, a faith-saving compromise that might have worked earlier. But Charles had come to Parliament precisely because he wanted public confrontation, wanted witnesses, wanted the entire nation to see government authority challenged, and found wanting. Private discussion had been tried repeatedly, according to the King's own statements. Those private channels had failed. Public demonstration of royal displeasure was the entire point of this unprecedented intervention. Charles declined the offer with a simple shake of his head, leaving Starmer standing alone and humiliated before hundreds of MPs and millions of viewers. The King then did something completely unexpected. He turned and began walking back toward the chamber exit, his business apparently concluded. But before leaving, he paused at the doorway and delivered a final statement. He expressed hope that government would reflect carefully on the concerns raised, that proper constitutional consultation would be restored, that the balance between Crown and Parliament could be maintained through mutual respect rather than confrontation. The words sounded conciliatory on surface, but carried an unmistakable threat underneath. They implied that today's intervention could be repeated if necessary, that the King retained options for applying pressure if his concerns continued being ignored. Charles had fired a warning shot, and everyone understood that next time he might use live ammunition in the form of even more dramatic constitutional interventions. As the chamber door closed behind the King, pandemonium erupted completely. MPs shouted across the aisle, accusing each other of enabling or provoking the crisis. Cabinet ministers huddled around Starmer, offering advice and support, while clearly panicking about their own positions. Opposition leaders demanded emergency debates, called for votes of no confidence, sensed political blood in the water. The Speaker suspended proceedings indefinitely, unable to restore any semblance of order. MPs filed out in clusters, immediately racing to give interviews to waiting journalists, each offering their own interpretation of what had just transpired. The story was being written in real time, and everyone wanted to shape the narrative before it hardened into accepted history. Outside Parliament, crowds had gathered after word spread on social media about the extraordinary confrontation happening inside. Royalist supporters waved Union Jacks and chanted support for King Charles, praising him for standing up to government overreach. Republican activists held signs demanding abolition of the monarchy, arguing this proved the institution had no place in modern democracy. Police struggled to keep the two groups separated. Tensions rose. Britain hadn't seen this level of constitutional crisis in generations. The stability and continuity that defined British political life for decades suddenly seemed fragile. Everything that had been taken for granted about how power operated, about the relationship between Crown and government, about the unwritten rules governing constitutional monarchy. All of it had been thrown into question by one man's decision to walk into Parliament and confront the Prime Minister directly. The shockwaves would continue spreading for days, weeks, possibly years to come. Britain would never be quite the same after what happened in Westminster today. Claude Ezayan can make mistakes. Please double check responses.